The flowers appeared every Tuesday morning, fresh as morning dew, on a grave that shouldn't exist. My name is Maria Santos, and I've been groundskeeper at Restwood Cemetery for 12 years. I know every plot, every headstone, every tree that casts shade over our residence. I know which graves settle after heavy rains and which ones the sprinklers miss. Most importantly, I know our records like the back of my weathered hands. Plot 47B has been empty since 1993. According to our burial charts, that section was cleared for expansion, but never developed. The ground there is level, unmarked, just grass that I mow every Thursday along with the rest of Section 7. Yet every Tuesday, without fail, someone places white lilies there. Not just any lilies, perfect specimens. 6 stems arranged in a precise circle, their petals still wet with moisture that feels too cold for morning dew. I first noticed them 3 months ago during my routine morning walkthrough. The flowers sat directly in the center of what would be plot 47B, arranged so carefully they looked almost surgical in their placement. I figured someone had made a mistake, confused about where their loved one was buried. It happens more often than you'd think. Grief can muddle memory, make people see headstones that aren't there, remember plots in the wrong section. I gathered the flowers, thinking kindly of whoever had left them. The stems were still damp, and I noticed how fresh they looked, as if they'd been cut moments before. But when I checked our records, no one was scheduled for that section. No recent burials, no reserved plots, just empty ground that had been empty for decades. The following Tuesday, they appeared again. Same spot, same arrangement, same impossible freshness. This time I decided to investigate. I checked with the office staff, thinking maybe we'd had a private burial I hadn't been informed about. Nothing. I called the local florists, asking if anyone had ordered weekly lily deliveries to our cemetery. 3 shops later, I had my answer. No one. By the 4th week, I was watching the security footage. Our cameras cover most of the main pathways and entrances, installed after some vandalism issues 2 years back. I pulled up the recordings from Monday night through Tuesday morning, expecting to catch whoever was leaving the flowers. The timestamp showed 3:17 a.m. when the flowers appeared. One frame showed empty grass, the next showed the lilies in perfect formation. No person, no movement, no explanation. Just flowers materializing as if they'd grown there overnight. I watched the footage 3 times, then called our security company thinking the cameras had malfunctioned. The technician arrived that afternoon, a young man named Derek, who seemed competent enough. He checked every angle, every connection, ran diagnostics on the recording system. Everything worked perfectly. He even showed me the motion sensors were functioning correctly. They detected a rabbit hopping through Section 3 at 2:45 a.m., a raccoon near the maintenance shed at 4:21 a.m. But at 3:17 a.m., when the flowers appeared, the sensors registered nothing. Maybe someone's throwing them over the fence, Derek suggested, though we both knew the nearest fence was 50 yards away. Or they figured out the camera's blind spot. But there was no blind spot. The flowers appeared directly in view of camera 12, and the motion sensors covered that entire area. Derek left, promising to review the footage again, though I could tell he was as puzzled as I was. I started arriving earlier on Tuesday mornings, parking near Section 7 and waiting in my truck with a thermos of coffee and a growing sense of unease. The first Tuesday I watched, from 3 a.m. until sunrise. Nothing. No person, no movement, no explanation for the flowers that were somehow there when I finally walked over to check. The second Tuesday, I brought binoculars and positioned myself with a clear view of plot 47B. At 3:16 a.m., I focused on the exact spot where the flowers always appeared. At 3:17 a.m., they were there. I didn't see them arrive. I didn't blink or look away. 1 second the ground was empty, the next it held 6 perfect white lilies arranged in a circle, their petals gleaming with moisture in the pre-dawn darkness. My hands shook as I drove home that morning. 37 years old, raised Catholic, college educated, and I was seeing flowers materialize from thin air. I told myself there had to be an explanation. Underground sprinkler system malfunction. Some kind of optical illusion caused by the security lighting. Mass hallucination, brought on by too much coffee and too little sleep. But I couldn't explain the moisture on the petals, always too cold, too perfect. I couldn't explain why the flowers never wilted, staying fresh for exactly 7 days before disappearing completely, leaving no trace of stems or petals. Most of all, I couldn't explain the feeling I got standing near that plot, a sensation like being watched, like standing at the edge of something vast and unknowable. Last Tuesday, I broke protocol. Instead of collecting the flowers, I left them where they appeared. When I returned the next morning, they were gone. Not wilted, not scattered by wind, simply gone, as if they'd never existed. The ground showed no depression where they'd sat, no evidence of their presence except for my own memory and the security footage that showed them clearly for 24 hours before showing empty grass once again. I've stopped trying to solve the mystery. Instead, I've started checking the records more carefully, wondering if Plot 47B was truly empty all these years. The paperwork says yes, but paperwork can be wrong. Sometimes the ground remembers things we've forgotten. Sometimes the dead find ways to remind us they're still there, still waiting, still needing someone to acknowledge their presence with flowers that bloom in impossible places. Every Tuesday morning now, I nod respectfully toward Plot 47B before beginning my rounds. The flowers still appear, perfect and precise and unexplainable, and I've learned that some mysteries are meant to be witnessed, not solved. The dead have their own schedules, their own needs. Who am I to interfere with flowers left for someone who may not officially exist, but who clearly, somehow, still remembers how to receive them? Mrs. Chen was supposed to be facing the wall, but when I arrived for the evening viewing, she was looking directly at the chapel door. I'm Thomas Blackwood, funeral director at Peaceful Harbor Memorial Home for 15 years. In this business, you learn to notice details that matter to the living. The angle of a body in the casket, the fold of hands, the expression preserved by careful preparation. These details bring comfort to grieving families, and getting them wrong can compound their pain. I've never gotten them wrong, not once in 15 years, until Mrs. Chen decided to turn her head. Eleanor Chen, age 74, passed peacefully in her sleep on a Monday morning in late October. Natural death, no trauma, just the quiet end that comes to us all eventually. Her daughter Lisa arranged for a simple viewing, 2 sessions to accommodate family traveling from out of state. The afternoon viewing from 2 to 4 p.m., evening viewing from 6 to 8 p.m., funeral service the following morning. During preparation, Lisa had been very specific about her mother's positioning. She never liked having her back to doorways, Lisa explained while we reviewed the service details. Even in restaurants, she'd insist on facing the entrance. She said she needed to see who was coming and going. It was almost a phobia. She'd get genuinely distressed if she couldn't see the door. So we positioned Mrs. Chen in the casket facing the side wall of the chapel, away from both the entrance and the viewing area where mourners would gather. The afternoon viewing went perfectly. Mrs. Chen looked peaceful, her silver hair arranged just as Lisa had requested, her favorite blue dress complementing the pale silk lining of the casket. About 30 people came through, mostly elderly friends from her neighborhood and church. Several mentioned how natural she looked, how the positioning allowed them to see her profile while maintaining dignity. Lisa seemed satisfied, even grateful. After the afternoon session ended, I performed my usual routine. I checked the temperature controls, adjust the lighting for evening viewing, ensure the chapel is ready for the next group of mourners. I always take a final look at the deceased to make sure everything remains as it should. Bodies can shift slightly during the day, and it's my responsibility to make any necessary adjustments. Mrs. Chen's positioning looked exactly as I'd left it. Head tilted slightly toward the wall, hands folded properly, expression serene. I made note of the temperature, 68 degrees, perfect for preservation and comfort. The evening viewing wasn't scheduled to begin for another hour, so I locked the chapel and went to my office to handle paperwork. The evening session started with Lisa arriving early, accompanied by her teenage son and Mrs. Chen's elderly sister, who'd flown in from Seattle. I unlocked the chapel and ushered them in, stepping back to allow them privacy for their first moments. That's when Lisa stopped short, her face confused. "Why did you move her?" she asked, her voice tight with concern. I looked toward the casket and felt my stomach drop. Mrs. Chen's head was turned toward the chapel entrance, facing the doorway she'd spent her lifetime avoiding. Not just slightly turned, completely oriented toward the door, as if she'd been positioned that way from the beginning. Her expression remained peaceful, but her entire head had rotated roughly 45 degrees from where I'd last seen it. "I didn't move her," I said, though I immediately began questioning my own memory. Had I positioned her incorrectly? Had I somehow misunderstood Lisa's instructions? Let me check my notes. But I knew my notes were accurate. I knew exactly how we'd positioned Mrs. Chen because Lisa had been so emphatic about it. More importantly, I knew what I'd seen just an hour earlier during my final check. Mrs. Chen had been facing the wall, and now she was facing the door. "She looks upset," the sister whispered, and I understood what she meant. Mrs. Chen's expression hadn't changed exactly, but something about her overall appearance suggested distress. Maybe it was the way the lighting hit her face from this new angle, or maybe it was the knowledge that she was positioned precisely how she wouldn't have wanted to be positioned. I made apologies, suggested that the body might have shifted naturally during the day, offered to adjust her positioning. But rigor mortis had set in hours earlier. Bodies don't just turn their heads after rigor mortis establishes itself. The muscles become rigid, the joints lock in place. What I was looking at was medically impossible. Lisa declined my offer to reposition her mother. "Don't move her again," she said quietly. "If this is how she wants to face, then maybe she has her reasons now." The evening viewing continued with about 20 more visitors. Several commented on how alert Mrs. Chen looked, how she seemed to be watching over everyone who entered the chapel. One elderly man mentioned that she appeared to be greeting people as they arrived, which struck me as both touching and deeply unsettling. After the viewing ended, I stayed late to observe the chapel. I positioned myself where I could see the casket clearly and waited, watching for any sign of movement. The chapel remained perfectly still. Mrs. Chen's position didn't change throughout my vigil, though I found myself increasingly aware of feeling watched, as if she were studying me as intently as I was studying her. The next morning, Mrs. Chen was still facing the doorway. During the funeral service, several people mentioned how peaceful she looked, how she seemed to be acknowledging each person who came to pay respects. Lisa thanked me for the beautiful service, never again mentioning her mother's repositioning. But I couldn't forget it. I started paying closer attention to the bodies in our care, checking positions more frequently, documenting everything with photographs. In the months since Mrs. Chen's service, I've witnessed 3 more instances of unexplained repositioning. Always subtle. Always just enough to change the feeling of the viewing. Always seeming to reflect some preference or need of the deceased that hadn't been apparent in life. I've stopped trying to explain it to families. When they notice changes, I simply acknowledge that their loved one has found a comfortable position. Most seem to find comfort in this explanation, as if the dead are still capable of small preferences, small comforts. Mrs. Chen taught me that our careful positioning, our attention to every detail, might not be the final word on how the dead choose to face eternity. Sometimes they have their own ideas about dignity, their own needs for how they want to meet the people who come to remember them. I still check positions carefully, still document everything properly, but now I also listen when families tell me about their loved one's preferences and habits. And if someone moves themselves after I've positioned them, I try to understand it as communication rather than failure. The dead, it seems, know things about saying goodbye that the living are still learning. The refrigeration unit showed drawer 7 running 15 degrees warmer than the others, but the body inside felt like winter itself had settled in his bones. My name is Elena Rodriguez, and I've been a mortuary technician at Downtown Memorial Services for 8 years. I know the sound of every machine in this building, the proper temperature for preservation, the routine that keeps everything running smoothly. I also know that refrigeration units don't lie when the digital display shows a temperature. That's the temperature inside the drawer. Except for drawer 7, which seemed to follow different rules entirely. The body arrived on a Thursday morning in February. Marcus Wellington, 26 years old, found in his apartment after what the coroner determined was sudden cardiac arrest. No drugs, no alcohol, no obvious cause, just a young man's heart that stopped beating on one of the coldest nights of the year. The apartment manager said the heat had been out for 3 days due to a broken furnace, and the temperature inside had dropped to nearly freezing. Marcus's sister Jennifer came in that afternoon to make arrangements. She was still in shock, barely able to process the paperwork, but she kept mentioning how Marcus had always been cold. Even in summer he wore long sleeves, she said. He'd have the air conditioning off and still be shivering. We used to joke that he was part reptile, always seeking heat. He spent a fortune on electric blankets and space heaters. We placed Marcus in drawer 7 of our main refrigeration unit, set to the standard 38 degrees Fahrenheit. These units are commercial grade, reliable, with digital displays that monitor temperature precisely. Each drawer maintains its own climate control, and the system logs temperatures every hour for our records. In 8 years, I'd never seen a malfunction. The next morning, I noticed the anomaly during my routine check. Drawers 1 through 6 showed 38 degrees exactly. Drawer 8 showed 37 degrees. Drawer 7 showed 53 degrees, 15 degrees above the setting, warm enough to compromise preservation. But when I opened drawer 7 to check on Marcus, cold air rolled out like fog, and the body felt ice cold to the touch. I called our refrigeration service immediately. Dave, the technician who'd been servicing our units for over a decade, arrived within 2 hours. He ran comprehensive diagnostics on drawer 7, checked the cooling coils, tested the thermostat, examined every component. Everything functioned perfectly. The unit was maintaining exactly 38 degrees, just as it should. But the display shows 53, I pointed out, showing him the digital readout. Dave looked puzzled. The internal temperature is 38. I can verify that with my own thermometer. He placed his device inside drawer 7, and it confirmed 38 degrees. The display must have a glitch. I can replace the digital unit, but the cooling system is working fine. Yet when we both touched Marcus's body, it felt significantly colder than the other bodies in adjacent drawers. Dave commented on it himself. That's strange. He feels like he's been stored at 20 degrees, not 38. He checked his thermometer again. Still, 38 degrees. After Dave left, I started monitoring drawer 7 more closely. Every day, the display showed temperatures ranging from 50 to 60 degrees, always 15 to 20 degrees above the setting. Every day, the actual temperature inside measured 38 degrees with independent thermometers. And every day, Marcus felt colder than he should, as if his body was absorbing cold from somewhere else. Jennifer visited later that week to finalize service details. While we reviewed options in my office, she mentioned something that stayed with me. The coroner said Marcus died around midnight, but the neighbors heard his space heater running until about 3 a.m. The police found it plugged in, set to maximum heat, but the apartment was still freezing. They said it was like the heater couldn't keep up with the cold. I didn't mention the refrigeration issue to Jennifer. No point in adding to her grief with technical problems that didn't affect our ability to provide proper care. But I found myself thinking about that space heater, running at maximum power but unable to warm Marcus's apartment. Just as our refrigeration unit seemed unable to warm his body, despite the display claiming it was running hot, Dave returned twice more that week, each time confirming that the cooling system worked perfectly, while the display showed impossible readings. He replaced the digital unit, then the entire control board, then the temperature sensors. Nothing changed. Drawer 7 continued to display warm temperatures while maintaining cold ones, and Marcus continued to feel like winter, personified. The morning of Marcus's service, I performed one final check. Drawer 7 displayed 55 degrees. My independent thermometer read 38 degrees. Marcus's body felt cold enough to make my fingers ache through protective gloves. But more than that, the cold seemed to radiate beyond the body itself. The drawer's interior walls, the metal surfaces, even the air inside felt charged with an impossible chill. During preparation for the viewing, something else became apparent. Marcus's skin had taken on an unusual pallor, almost blue-white, despite perfect preservation otherwise. When Jennifer saw him in the casket, she smiled for the first time since his death. "He looks peaceful," she said, "and finally warm. Look at his face, he's not shivering anymore." I saw what she meant. Marcus did look peaceful, but not warm. He looked like someone who had finally stopped fighting the cold, who had accepted it as part of himself. His expression was serene, but his skin held the faint blue undertone of someone who had been deeply, permanently cold. After the service, Drawer 7 returned to normal. The digital display matched the actual temperature, and the strange cold that had radiated from Marcus's body disappeared. Dave came to check the unit one final time and found everything functioning exactly as designed. "Weird glitch," he said, shaking his head. "Never seen anything like it. But it's working perfectly now." I didn't tell him that I'd checked the maintenance logs and found that Drawer 7 had been installed during renovation work in 2015. The previous tenant of that space had been a man named Robert Chen, who had died during a blizzard when his building's heating failed. According to the records, Robert had been found frozen in his apartment, but the cause of death was listed as heart failure, brought on by hypothermia. Some people, it seems, carry cold with them, even after death. Marcus had spent his life fighting a chill that no heater could warm, and in death, he'd found a way to make that cold visible, measurable, undeniable. The refrigeration unit hadn't malfunctioned. It had simply encountered something colder than itself, something that made 38 degrees feel tropical by comparison. I still check Drawer 7 more often than the others, though it's been empty since Marcus's service. The display works normally now, but sometimes when I open it, I catch a hint of that same deep cold, as if the drawer remembers what it held and continues to honor that memory with an extra degree of chill. Every Tuesday at 11:47 p.m., my dispatch radio crackles with a pickup request for an address that burned to the ground in 1987. I'm Jake Morrison, and I've been driving transport for Riverside Funeral Services for 6 years. It's not glamorous work, but it's steady, and it serves a purpose that matters to people during their worst moments. I drive a respectful schedule, keep the hearse immaculate, and respond to calls regardless of weather or hour. The dead don't wait for convenient timing, and neither do the families who need our services. The calls started 3 months ago, always on Tuesday nights when I was working the late shift. Our dispatch system is computerized now when a hospital, coroner's office, or family calls for transport. The details appear on my screen and the radio confirms with location and contact information. Standard protocol. I acknowledge the call, drive to the specified address, and coordinate with whoever requested the pickup. The first call came through, clear as any other. Unit 7. Respond to pickup request at 415 Maple Street. Contact Helen Morrison on arrival. The name caught my attention. Morrison is my surname, though I'd never heard of a Helen in our family. But dispatch calls can come from anyone. Family members, coroners, hospital staff. I acknowledged and headed to Maple Street. 415 Maple Street sat in one of the older residential neighborhoods where trees grow thick and streetlights cast uneven shadows. I'd driven past that block hundreds of times over the years, but had never paid attention to individual addresses. When I arrived at 415, I found an empty lot, overgrown with weeds and blackened foundation stones barely visible through the undergrowth. I parked and stepped out, thinking I'd misheard the address or that dispatch had made an error. That's when I saw her, a woman in her 60s, standing at the edge of the lot, wearing a dark coat and holding a small handbag. She looked exactly like someone waiting for a funeral home pickup, composed but clearly in distress. "Are you Helen Morrison?" I called out as I approached. She turned toward me, and I could see her face clearly in the streetlight. Pale skin, silver hair pulled back, eyes that seemed to be looking through me rather than at me. She nodded once, then walked toward the center of the empty lot. "Ma'am, I think there's been some confusion," I said, following her. "This address, there's no building here." But when I reached the spot where she'd been standing, she was gone. Not walked away, not hidden behind the overgrown bushes, simply gone. As completely as if she'd never been there. The only trace of her presence was a faint scent in the air. Smoke and roses mixed together, sweet and acrid at the same time. I called dispatch for clarification. Unit 7 requesting confirmation on 415 Maple Street pickup. No building at this location, no contact person visible. Unit 7. We show no pickup request for Maple Street tonight. Your last call was the hospital run at 9:30 p.m. I argued with them for 10 minutes. I had the call logged on my screen, the address clearly displayed, the contact name in my notes, but when I looked at my screen again, the call had disappeared. My log showed the hospital pickup at 9:30 p.m., then nothing until this conversation with dispatch. The following Tuesday at 11:47 p.m., the call came through again. Same address, same contact name, same clear transmission. This time, I was ready with my phone camera to document everything. I recorded the dispatch screen, took photos of my call log, even recorded the radio transmission as backup evidence. 415 Maple Street looked exactly the same: empty lot, foundation stones, overgrown weeds. Helen Morrison stood in the same spot, wearing the same dark coat, holding the same handbag. I approached more cautiously this time, trying to speak with her before she could disappear. "Helen, I'm Jake from Riverside Funeral Services. Who are we here to pick up?" She looked at me with those same distant eyes, then pointed toward the foundation stones. "The children couldn't get out," she said in a voice that sounded like it was coming from underwater. "They were sleeping when the smoke started." Then she was gone again, leaving behind that same mixture of smoke and roses. Stronger this time, strong enough to make my eyes water. I checked my phone. All my documentation had vanished. The photos showed empty screens. The video recorded only static. The audio captured nothing but wind noise. I started researching 415 Maple Street between calls. The city records showed that a house had stood there until December 15th, 1987, when it was destroyed in a fire that killed 4 people. Helen Morrison, age 34, her 3 children ages 6, 9, and 12, and caused by an electrical fault that started in the basement around midnight. The lot had been cleared, but never rebuilt, eventually becoming city property that was never developed. Helen Morrison would be 69 years old now if she had survived. The woman I was seeing looked exactly the right age, exactly the right build based on the newspaper photos I found in the library's archives. But Helen Morrison had died 35 years ago, along with her children, in a fire that made front-page news for 3 days. The calls continued every Tuesday, always the same time, always the same address, always the same woman waiting by the foundation stones. Our conversations grew longer as I learned to approach her calmly, to listen to what she was trying to tell me. She spoke about her children, about trying to reach them through the smoke, about the sound of sirens that arrived too late. "I keep waiting," she told me during one of our encounters. They said someone would come to take us home, but no one ever comes. I realized what she meant. In 1987, Riverside Funeral Services hadn't existed yet. The company that had handled the Morrison family's arrangements had gone out of business years ago. Helen was still waiting for a pickup that had been scheduled 35 years earlier, appearing each week on the anniversary of the night she died. Last Tuesday, I brought something with me, a small bouquet of roses mixed with baby's breath. Simple, but respectful. When Helen appeared, I placed the flowers on the foundation stones where her house had stood. "Helen, I'm here for the pickup," I said gently. "Are you and the children ready to go home now?" For the first time, she smiled. "We've been waiting so long," she said. "The smoke is finally clearing." She walked toward the hearse, and I opened the back door for her. I couldn't see her anymore, but I could feel her presence as she climbed inside, could sense 3 smaller presences joining her. The smell of smoke faded, replaced entirely by the sweet scent of roses. I drove slowly through the quiet streets to Riverside Cemetery, where the Morrison family had been buried decades ago. When I opened the hearse at their gravesite, the presence I'd felt during the drive was gone, but the roses I'd brought had multiplied somehow 4 bouquets now, 1 large and 3 small, still fresh and perfect. I haven't received any more calls for 415 Maple Street. My Tuesday nights are quiet now, routine pickups and standard transport calls. But I drive past that empty lot sometimes, and it feels different now, peaceful rather than waiting, settled rather than restless. Some calls take longer to complete than others. Some families wait decades for the right transport to arrive. For someone who understands that the dead deserve dignity, regardless of how long they've been waiting for their final ride home. Every burial in the 7th row requires exactly 47 additional shovelfuls of dirt, and that extra soil appears warm and dry no matter what the weather brings. My name is Pete Kowalski, and I've been digging graves at Hillcrest Memorial Gardens for 19 years. I know soil like a farmer knows crops, the way it feels in different seasons. How much settles after rain, how long it takes to dry after winter thaw. I know the difference between clay that fights the shovel and loam that moves like it wants to be moved. Most importantly, I know how much dirt comes out of a 6-foot grave. Because physics doesn't lie, and earth doesn't multiply itself. Until row 7 decided to prove me wrong. Hillcrest is laid out in a grid system that makes sense if you're managing a cemetery, but means nothing to the families who visit. Rows 1 through 12 run east to west, with plots numbered sequentially within each row. Row 7 sits in the middle section, established in 1964, filled steadily over the decades with people who lived ordinary lives and deserved ordinary burials. Nothing special about the location, nothing unusual in the cemetery records, just another row of graves in ground that should behave like every other section. I first noticed the anomaly during a burial last spring. Margaret Chen, age 82, natural death, scheduled for a Tuesday morning service. I dug her grave the day before. Standard dimensions: 8 feet long, 4 feet wide, 6 feet deep. I measured the excavated soil carefully. It's part of my job to make sure we have enough dirt to properly fill the grave after the casket is lowered. The pile measured exactly what it should for those dimensions. The service went smoothly. Family gathered, words were spoken, casket was lowered with dignity. After the mourners left, I began filling the grave using the soil I'd excavated the day before. But as I worked, I realized I was running short. Not by a little, by roughly 47 shovelfuls, enough to leave the grave noticeably shallow. I double-checked my measurements, thinking I'd made an error during excavation. The grave was definitely 6 feet deep, the right length and width. The casket was standard size, accounting for the expected displacement. But somehow I needed nearly 2 cubic feet more soil than should have been physically possible. I fetched additional dirt from our stockpile, the clean soil we keep on hand for situations exactly like this. But that seemed wrong to me in 19 years. I'd never needed supplemental dirt for a properly dug grave. Earth goes out, earth goes back in. Simple mathematics that has never failed me before. 2 weeks later, I had another burial scheduled for row 7. Robert Martinez, plot 7-34, 3 graves down from where I'd buried Margaret Chen. This time I paid closer attention to every detail. I measured the excavation precisely, marked the soil pile with stakes to track its boundaries, even took photographs to document everything. The burial went normally, but again I found myself short of dirt when filling the grave. Exactly 47 shovelfuls short, just like with Margaret Chen. The math made no sense. I documented every step, verified every measurement, yet somehow row 7 was consuming more soil than I'd removed from it. I started testing my theory systematically. Over the next 6 months, I documented every burial in row 7 and compared them to burials in other sections. Rows 1 through 6 required exactly the amount of soil that came out of them. Rows 8 through 12, same story, perfect mathematical consistency. But every single burial in row 7 required exactly 47 additional shovelfuls of dirt. No matter the casket size, no matter the season, no matter the soil conditions. The extra dirt always came from the same source, a natural mound that had existed at the back of the cemetery since before Hillcrest opened. The soil there was different from our regular ground, darker, richer, with a consistency that felt almost alive under the shovel. It was also consistently warm and dry, even during the wettest periods or coldest winter months. I started arriving early on burial days to observe the soil behavior more closely. What I found made no scientific sense, but had undeniable consistency. The extra dirt I'd take from the mound would remain dry and warm throughout the burial process, even when the regular excavated soil was muddy from overnight rain. When I combined the two types of soil in the grave, they seemed to merge seamlessly, creating a uniform appearance that satisfied families and maintained proper drainage. One morning in late fall, I was preparing for a burial when Harold Visk, one of our longtime groundskeepers, approached my worksite. Harold had worked at Hillcrest for 34 years before retiring, and he still visited regularly to check on the grounds and share stories with current staff. "You're working row 7 again," he observed, watching me measure the excavated soil pile. "Yeah, Mrs. Patterson, plot 7-49. Nice lady, according to her family." Harold nodded thoughtfully. "You notice anything unusual about row 7 burials?" I looked at him carefully. "Like what?" "Like needing extra dirt every time. Like that dirt coming from the old mound back there. Staying warm no matter what the weather's doing." My surprise must have shown on my face. "You know about this?" Harold smiled. "Son, I dug graves in row 7 for 20 years before you took over. Same thing every time. 47 extra shovels needed. Every single burial. The math never worked, but the burials always turned out right." "Did you ever figure out why?" I asked around, looked into the history, found out that before Hillcrest was established, this whole area was farmland owned by a family named Morrison. They had a small family cemetery on their property, right where row 7 sits now. When the city bought the land for expansion, they were supposed to relocate all the existing graves, but records from the 1960s are incomplete. He paused, looking across row 7 with the expression of someone who'd spent decades puzzling over the same mystery. "My theory is that we're not just filling graves in row 7. We're filling gaps. Empty spaces where graves used to be but aren't officially recorded." The Morrison family cemetery probably had more burials than the paperwork shows. Country folk didn't always document every death, especially children, especially during hard times. So, the extra dirt is filling spaces that want to be filled. Graves that were disturbed when the land was cleared. Graves that are still waiting for proper burial. The warm soil from the mound that's Morrison land too, never been touched by development. It knows where it belongs. Harold's explanation made more sense than anything I'd theorized on my own, but it also raised questions I wasn't sure I wanted answered. If Row 7 contained unmarked graves from the Morrison family cemetery, what happened to those burials when Hillcrest was established? Were we unknowingly sharing space with people who'd been resting there for over a century? After Harold left, I started paying attention to more than just soil measurements. I noticed that Row 7 stayed quieter than other sections, even during busy visiting days. Flowers placed on graves there lasted longer, kept their color and freshness well past normal time. The grass grew differently too, thicker, greener, as if the soil held extra nutrients. Most significantly, I began to sense a feeling of acceptance during Row 7 burials. Other sections sometimes felt resistant tree roots, fighting the shovel, clay that stuck to tools, soil that seemed reluctant to be moved. But Row 7 welcomed new burials, made space for them easily, almost eagerly. The 47 extra shovelfuls became routine, expected, budgeted into my time estimates for Row 7 services. I started bringing soil from the mound automatically, knowing I'd need it regardless of measurements or mathematics. The warm, dry dirt from Morrison land mixed seamlessly with whatever I excavated, creating perfect burial conditions every time. Last month, during a burial for James Tucker, something unusual happened. After lowering the casket and beginning to fill the grave, I noticed that I needed exactly 46 shovelfuls of additional dirt, one less than the standard 47. It was the first deviation I'd seen in over 2 years of consistent patterns. That night, I checked the cemetery records more carefully. James Tucker had been buried in plot 7-56, the final available plot in Row 7. According to our grid system, the row was now completely full, every official space occupied. But the next week, our office received a call from Mrs. Tucker's daughter, asking about purchasing the plot next to her father's grave. When I checked, plot 7-57 didn't exist. According to our maps, Row 7 ended at 56. Yet when I walked the row measuring the spacing between headstones, there was clearly room for one more burial. I mentioned this to the cemetery manager, expecting him to explain the discrepancy in our mapping system. Instead, he smiled, knowingly. Row 7 has always had one extra space, he said. Been that way since I started here 15 years ago. We don't sell it officially, but somehow it always ends up getting used. Usually by someone whose family insists they belong there. Even when our records show Row 7 is full. Whose plot is it officially? According to the original deed, from when we purchased the Morrison land, that space belongs to unknown deceased, to be determined at time of need. Legal language from the 1960s that nobody understood then, and nobody understands now. But the county requires us to honor the original deed terms. This week, I started preparing that extra space plot 7-57, the burial that doesn't officially exist, but somehow always becomes necessary. I dug carefully, measuring precisely, expecting to need my usual 47 extra shovelfuls of Morrison soil. Instead, I found something that made me stop digging entirely. At exactly 4 feet down, my shovel struck something hard but not stone, solid but not root. When I cleared away the dirt, I found a metal marker, green with age, bearing a single word, Morrison. Under that marker, the soil was different, already loose, already prepared, as if someone had been expecting this grave to be dug for decades. The earth was warm and dark and rich, the same consistency as the soil from the back mound, the soil I'd been using to fill the gaps in Row 7 for the past 3 years. I haven't told anyone about the marker yet. Tomorrow, there's a burial scheduled for Row 7. Mrs. Chen's husband, finally joining his wife in the plot next to hers. But according to my measurements, Mr. Chen will be buried in the space where I found the Morrison marker, the space that officially doesn't exist. I suspect when I fill his grave, I won't need any extra soil at all. The earth will accept him completely, and the 47 shovelful pattern will finally make sense. Some places hold more than they appear to hold, and some soil remembers longer than records can document. Row 7 taught me that the ground beneath our feet has its own memory, its own sense of justice. Sometimes the dead share space across centuries, making room for each other in ways that defy our careful measurements and official documentation. And sometimes, a gravedigger's job is less about moving earth and more about helping old debts find their proper resolution. The handwritten notes appear in our guest registry books after every service, signed by names that don't match any living relatives, all carrying the same message, dated exactly 1 year in the future. I'm Sandra Walsh, Memorial Home Clerk at Eternal Rest Funeral Chapel, and I've been managing our guest registries for 11 years. These books serve an important purpose. They help families track who attended services, provide comfort during grief, and create lasting records of community support. I maintain them carefully, review them after each service, and store them properly for families who want to reference them later. It's detailed work that requires attention, which is why I notice immediately when something appears that shouldn't be there. The entries started showing up 6 months ago, always in the same careful cursive handwriting, always appearing sometime between the end of services and my Monday morning review. At first, I thought mourners were returning after hours to add messages they'd forgotten during the emotional stress of the service. People grieve differently, and some need time to find the right words. The first one appeared after Margaret Wilson's memorial service. Margaret had lived to 93, surrounded by a large family who filled our chapel completely. The service was beautiful, well attended, with dozens of signatures in the guest book from friends, neighbors, and relatives spanning 3 generations. When I reviewed the book Monday morning, I found an additional entry at the bottom of the last page. I should have been there sooner. William Wilson, October 15, 2025. The handwriting was distinctive, flowing, cursive script that looked like it belonged to someone from an earlier generation, when penmanship was taught as carefully as reading. But what struck me as odd was the date, October 15, 2025. Margaret's service had been on October 15, 2024. Someone had written next year's date instead of this year's. I assumed it was a simple mistake. Grief can cause confusion, make people lose track of time and dates. But when I checked our attendee information against the Wilson family tree, I couldn't find any William Wilson among Margaret's relatives. I called her son Robert to ask about the entry. William was my grandfather, Robert explained. Margaret's husband. He died 8 years ago. We named my youngest son after him, but little William is only 4 years old, and his handwriting looks nothing like that. I apologized for the confusion and filed the incident away as one of those unexplained quirks that happen in any business that deals with strong emotions and family dynamics. Sometimes people sign incorrect names. Sometimes dates get confused. Sometimes distant relatives appear at services without introducing themselves to immediate family. 2 weeks later, after Daniel Kowalski's service, I found another entry in identical handwriting. I should have been there sooner. Anna Kowalski, November 2nd, 2025. Again, dated exactly 1 year in the future. Again, signed by someone the family didn't recognize as a living relative. Daniel's daughter confirmed that Anna Kowalski had been Daniel's sister, deceased for over 15 years. The handwriting didn't match any living family member, and no one remembered seeing anyone add entries to the guest book after the service ended. By the third occurrence, I knew I was dealing with something that demanded careful documentation. After each service, I started photographing the guest book pages immediately, then checking them again Monday morning to identify any additions. The pattern became unmistakably consistent. Services held on the 15th of each month produced mysterious entries, always in the same handwriting, always signed by deceased relatives, always dated exactly 1 year in the future. I began researching the names that appeared in these entries. Every signature belonged to someone who had died years or decades before the current service. Always someone closely related to the deceased, but not always someone the surviving family remembered well. Elderly spouses who died years earlier, siblings who'd passed in childhood, parents who died when the deceased was young. The messages never varied. I should have been there sooner. Always the same words, always the same regretful tone, as if the signers were apologizing for missing something important. I started staying late on the 15th of each month, positioning myself where I could observe the guest book after services ended. Our chapel locks automatically at 6 p.m., but staff can remain inside for cleaning and administrative work. I wanted to catch whoever was adding these entries. During October's vigil, I maintained line of sight with the guest book from 5:30 p.m. until nearly midnight. The chapel remained empty, the book undisturbed. But when I checked the pages the next morning, the entry was there. I should have been there sooner. Helen Martinez. October 15th, 2025. Helen Martinez had been the deceased woman's mother, dead for 37 years. The handwriting was identical to all previous entries, and the ink looked fresh, as if it had been written moments before I found it. I installed a motion-activated camera focused on the guest book area, thinking I might be missing someone who entered after I left for the evening. The camera recorded continuously from the end of services until morning, but it never captured anyone approaching the book or writing in it. Yet the entries continued to appear, always on schedule, always in the same handwriting, always carrying the same message of regret. Last month, I decided to test whether the entries would appear if I removed the guest book entirely. After November's service, I locked the guest registry in my desk drawer and took the key home with me. Monday morning, I unlocked the drawer to find the book exactly where I'd left it, but with a new entry on the appropriate page. I should have been there sooner. Robert Chen, November 15th, 2025. The entry had appeared in a locked drawer, in a book that no one else could access, written by someone who'd been dead for decades. I started questioning my own sanity until I realized that questioning sanity was probably appropriate when dealing with whatever was happening in our chapel. I began approaching the mystery differently, treating the entries as genuine communications rather than pranks or hallucinations. If dead relatives were somehow writing in our guest books, what were they trying to communicate? Why always the same message? Why always dated 1 year in the future? The breakthrough came when I started researching the specific dates being written. Every entry was dated exactly 1 year after the service, which meant they were all pointing toward future dates that hadn't happened yet. I began tracking those dates, wondering if they held significance. October 15th, 2025, the date from the first entry, fell on a Wednesday. When I checked historical records, I found that Margaret Wilson's husband, William, had died on a Wednesday, October 15th, exactly 8 years earlier. The entry wasn't just dated 1 year in the future. It was dated for the exact day of the week when William had originally died. I checked the other entries against death records for the people signing them. Every future date matched the day of the week when that person had originally died. Anna Kowalski had died on a Saturday, and November 2nd, 2025 fell on a Saturday. Helen Martinez had died on a Wednesday, and October 15th, 2025 was a Wednesday. The deceased relatives weren't just signing our guest books, they were marking anniversary dates, reminding their families when they would need extra support, when grief might resurface unexpectedly. I should have been there sooner wasn't an apology for missing the funeral. It was a promise to be present on the anniversary dates, when the living might need them most. This December 15th, I'll be watching our guest book again, but with different expectations. Instead of trying to catch someone in the act of writing mysterious entries, I'll be documenting messages from people who found a way to reach across death, to offer comfort on the days when comfort will be needed most. The guest registry books have become more than records of who attended services. They've become appointment books for the dead. scheduling their presence for the moments when the living need reassurance that love continues beyond death, that family bonds remain strong enough to transcend time and space and the boundaries between life and death. Tomorrow is December 15th, and the Chen family is burying their grandmother. I suspect we'll receive another entry, signed by someone who wants the Chen family to know that anniversaries don't have to be faced alone, that some appointments are too important to miss, even from the other side of death. Funeral flowers delivered to Hillcrest Cemetery wilt from the inside out within minutes, but only on graves of people who died completely alone. My name is David Chen, and I've been arranging funeral flowers for Morrison's florist for 14 years. I understand the language of flowers, the way different blooms convey different emotions, the importance of creating arrangements that honor both the deceased and the feelings of those left behind. I also understand the biology of cut flowers, how long they last, what makes them fade, why some arrangements stay fresh for days while others wilt within hours. What I don't understand is why perfectly healthy flowers begin dying the moment they're placed on certain graves at Hillcrest Cemetery. The pattern became apparent gradually, over several months of deliveries that behaved in ways that defied everything I knew about flower preservation. At first, I blamed external factors: unusual weather, soil conditions, vandalism, poor timing between cutting and delivery. But careful observation revealed that the problem was specific, predictable, and completely unrelated to any normal cause of floral decay. It started with an arrangement for Eleanor Vance, a simple spray of white lilies and baby's breath that I'd prepared with extra care. Eleanor had been 91 when she died, no surviving family, found in her apartment 3 days after passing by a neighbor who noticed her mail piling up. The county arranged for a basic burial, and our shop received an anonymous order for grave flowers to be delivered weekly for a month. I delivered the first arrangement on a Tuesday morning, placing it carefully against Eleanor's temporary marker in Section 4. The flowers were perfect fresh, properly hydrated, arranged to last at least a week in moderate weather. But when I returned Thursday for another delivery in the same section, Eleanor's flowers had turned completely brown, their petals dry and brittle as autumn leaves. I assumed the flowers had been damaged by heat or wind, though the weather had been mild and other arrangements in the area looked fine. I replaced them with a more robust selection: chrysanthemums and roses that typically last longer in outdoor conditions. By Saturday, these flowers were dead too, not just wilted, but desiccated, as if all moisture had been drawn out of them in a matter of days. The third delivery taught me that timing was critical to understanding what was happening. I arrived at Hillcrest with Eleanor's replacement flowers and decided to observe them for a few minutes before leaving. I positioned the arrangement against her marker, stepped back to check the placement, and watched as the outer petals began to curl inward. Within 10 minutes, brown spots appeared at the center of each bloom. Within 20 minutes, the entire arrangement looked like it had been sitting in desert heat for weeks. I'd never seen flowers die so quickly, or in such a specific pattern from the inside out, as if something at the center of each bloom was consuming the life force and spreading outward. The stems remained green and firm, but the flowers themselves became hollow shells, beautiful from a distance, but empty and brittle when examined closely. I mentioned the anomaly to other florists in town, thinking it might be a soil problem specific to that section of the cemetery. But colleagues who delivered to other areas of Hillcrest reported normal flower longevity. The issue was limited to certain graves, not the entire cemetery. Over the following months, I began tracking which graves experienced rapid flower decay. The pattern was disturbing in its consistency. Every grave that killed flowers within hours belonged to someone who had died alone. Not just unmarried people or those without family, but people who had literally been alone at the moment of death, with no one present, no one holding their hand, no one offering comfort during their final moments. Eleanor Vance had been alone for 3 days before discovery. Thomas Manning, whose flowers I delivered the following month, had died alone in a hospital during a night shift when no visitors were allowed. Sarah Chen, no relation to me despite the shared surname, had lived as a recluse and died alone in her garden, not found until weeks later. Each of these graves consumed flower arrangements within hours, wilting them from the center outward in the same distinctive pattern. Meanwhile, graves of people who had died surrounded by family, or even with just one person present, maintained flower arrangements for normal periods. I started experimenting with different types of flowers, thinking some varieties might be more resistant to whatever was affecting these particular graves. Hardy wildflowers died as quickly as delicate roses. Artificial flowers, silk, and plastic arrangements that shouldn't be affected by any biological process faded and cracked as if exposed to extreme age. The breakthrough came when I began timing my deliveries more precisely. During a delivery for James Kowalski, another man who died alone in his apartment, I decided to document the decay process with photographs. I placed the arrangement white carnations and greenery at 11:30 a.m. and began taking pictures every 5 minutes. The photographs revealed something I hadn't noticed during casual observation. The decay didn't start randomly at the center of the flowers. It began at specific points within each bloom, points that formed a pattern when viewed across the entire arrangement. The brown spots appeared to be reaching towards something, extending like fingers or tendrils toward the center of the grave. By noon, the pattern was unmistakable. The dying flowers were leaning inward, their wilted petals pointing down toward the buried casket, as if they were trying to reach the person below ground. The arrangement wasn't just dying, it was being pulled downward, drawn toward someone who was drawing all available life and beauty toward themselves. I shared my observations with Father Martinez, who had conducted several of the funeral services for people buried in the affected graves. He listened carefully to my description of the flower behavior and nodded with the expression of someone confirming a suspicion he'd held for some time. "Loneliness is a powerful force," he said quietly. "In life, it draws people together, creates communities, compels us to seek connection. Death doesn't necessarily end that compulsion. Some people die so alone, so hungry for companionship, that they continue reaching out for whatever beauty or life comes near them. But they're taking the flowers? They're accepting whatever offering is made. Flowers represent life, color, the attention of the living. For someone who died completely alone, even the brief presence of fresh flowers might be enough to satisfy a deep need for connection." Father Martinez suggested a different approach to grave flowers for people who died alone. Instead of elaborate arrangements designed to last for days, he recommended simple offerings, changed frequently, single flowers, small bouquets, arrangements that could be completely consumed without lasting loss. I started implementing his suggestion, delivering single stems twice weekly instead of large arrangements meant to last a week. The individual flowers still wilted quickly, but the graves seemed more peaceful somehow, less desperate in their consumption of whatever was offered. Last month, I received an unusual order for Eleanor Vance's grave. An elderly woman calling herself a distant cousin wanted flowers delivered monthly for a year, but with specific instructions, just one flower each time. Something simple and beautiful. Let her know someone is thinking of her. I've been following those instructions, placing a single fresh bloom on Eleanor's grave every month. Each flower wilts within hours, drawn down toward the earth in the same pattern I've observed for months. But something has changed about the process. The wilting seems gentler now, less desperate, more like acceptance than consumption. Yesterday, I visited Eleanor's grave to place December's flower, a single white rose. As I positioned it against her marker, I felt a sensation I'd never experienced during previous deliveries. Gratitude. Not my own gratitude, but something emanating from the grave itself. A sense of appreciation so strong, it was almost tangible. The rose wilted quickly, as expected, but its petals fell in a perfect circle around the marker, creating a natural wreath that looked intentional, planned, artistic. For the first time, I understood that the flowers weren't being destroyed, they were being transformed into something else, incorporated into a different kind of beauty that exists in the space between life and death. Some people carry loneliness so deep that death can't cure it, but sometimes the simple act of offering beauty, even beauty that will be quickly consumed, can ease that loneliness enough to bring peace. The flowers I delivered to Hillcrest Cemetery serve different purposes depending on who receives them, and I've learned that rapid wilting isn't always a sign of failure. Sometimes it's a sign of desperate gratitude, finally being satisfied. The night security cameras capture mourners visiting graves after midnight, walking with purpose but leaving no footprints in the wet grass, casting no shadows under the floodlights. I'm Carmen Rodriguez, night security supervisor at Restwood Memorial Cemetery, and I've been watching over the dead for 7 years. My job involves monitoring 24 security cameras positioned throughout the grounds, conducting hourly walking patrols, and ensuring that our residents rest undisturbed by vandals or trespassers. It's quiet work most nights, peaceful in the way that only cemeteries can be peaceful. The dead make excellent neighbors they keep to themselves, never complain about noise, and generally cause fewer problems than the living. Until I started noticing the visitors who appear on camera but leave no trace of their presence on the ground. Our security system is comprehensive, installed 3 years ago after a series of vandalism incidents that damaged several headstones in the older sections. 24 high-resolution cameras with night vision capabilities cover every major pathway and section of the cemetery. Motion sensors trigger automatic recording, and floodlights activate when movement is detected after sunset. The system is reliable, efficient, and thorough enough to capture everything from raccoons searching for food to teenagers attempting to use the cemetery for unauthorized activities. The anomalous footage started appearing 6 months ago, always during the deepest hours of night, typically between 2 and 4 a.m. The first recording showed a figure walking slowly along the main pathway toward Section 7, moving with the careful, deliberate pace of someone visiting a specific grave. The person appeared solid and clearly defined on camera. Elderly woman, dark coat, carrying what looked like flowers. I assumed she was a mourner who couldn't sleep, driven by grief to visit a loved one's grave during quiet hours. It happens more often than people realize. Families dealing with fresh loss often find themselves unable to follow normal schedules, compelled to seek comfort at unusual times. Our policy is to allow respectful visitation anytime, as long as visitors don't disturb the grounds or other families. What struck me as odd was the timing. The woman appeared on camera at 2:14 a.m., walking from the main entrance toward Section 7, but I had no record of anyone entering the cemetery grounds. Our gates lock automatically at sunset, and opening them requires either a key or triggering the alarm system. The entrance cameras showed no activity, no gates opening, no vehicles in the parking area. I reviewed the footage more carefully, following the woman's path through multiple camera angles as she moved through the cemetery. She walked directly to a specific grave in Section 7, placed her flowers against the headstone, and stood quietly for exactly 7 minutes. Then she walked back toward the main entrance, disappearing from camera view at 2:31 a.m. The next morning, I walked Section 7 during my rounds, expecting to find the flowers she'd placed. The grave she'd visited belonged to Margaret Chen, a recent burial, but I found no flowers, no disturbance of the grass, no sign that anyone had visited during the night. The ground around Margaret's headstone was damp from overnight dew, unmarked by footprints despite the clear footage of someone standing there for 7 minutes. I checked the recording again, thinking I'd misidentified the location, but the camera angle clearly showed the woman standing directly in front of Margaret's grave, placing flowers that I could see distinctly on the recording, but couldn't find on the ground. The footage was clear, detailed, undeniably real. The physical evidence was non-existent. Over the following weeks, similar recordings appeared regularly, always during the deep night hours, always showing solitary figures walking purposefully to specific graves, always leaving no physical trace despite clear documentation of their presence. The figures varied: elderly men, middle-aged women, occasionally younger adults, but they shared common characteristics: slow, respectful movement, direct paths to specific graves, brief visits lasting exactly 7 minutes, complete absence of footprints or other physical evidence. I started paying closer attention to lighting conditions during these visits. Our floodlights activate automatically when motion is detected, illuminating large areas around each triggered camera. The visiting figures appeared clearly in this lighting, their clothing and movements visible in sharp detail. But they cast no shadows on the ground, created no dark spaces behind them, despite standing directly under bright illumination. The realization that these visitors cast no shadows was deeply unsettling. Shadows are basic physics objects. Blocking light sources create dark areas behind them. Even transparent materials create some shadow effect. But the figures on our security footage appeared to exist without affecting light in any way, as if they were projections rather than physical beings. I began documenting each incident systematically, noting the time, location, duration, and appearance of each visitor. Patterns emerged that made the mystery more complex rather than less. The visitors always appeared on anniversary dates: the weekly, monthly, or yearly anniversary of someone's death or burial. They always visited the correct grave without hesitation, suggesting intimate knowledge of the cemetery layout. Most significantly, they always visited graves of people who had died recently, within the past year. I started researching the specific graves being visited, checking our burial records against the dates when footage was captured. Every mysterious visitor appeared on a significant anniversary related to the person buried in the grave they visited. The elderly woman visiting Margaret Chen appeared exactly 1 week after Margaret's burial. A middle-aged man visiting Thomas Rodriguez appeared 1 month after Thomas's funeral. A younger woman visiting Sarah Kim appeared 6 months after Sarah's death. The visitors weren't random figures wandering through the cemetery. They were specific people visiting specific graves on specific anniversary dates, maintaining some kind of schedule that transcended normal visiting hours and normal physical limitations. Last month, I decided to test my growing theory about who these visitors might be. When footage showed an elderly man visiting Robert Martinez's grave, I researched Robert's family history and funeral arrangements. Robert had died 3 months earlier, survived by his wife Elena and 2 adult children. I called Elena Martinez the next day, carefully asking about her family's visiting patterns without mentioning the security footage. "We try to visit every Sunday after church," Elena told me. "But my husband's father, he passed away 12 years ago. He loved Robert so much. Always said he wished he could visit more often when he was alive. Last night I dreamed about him visiting Robert's grave, bringing him flowers like he used to do when he was alive." The elderly man on our security footage had appeared exactly 12 years after Robert's father had died, on the monthly anniversary of Robert's death. Elena's dream had occurred on the same night our cameras captured the visit. I've stopped questioning the physics of shadows and footprints. Instead, I've started thinking of our security system as documenting a different kind of visiting schedule, one that operates outside normal hours and normal limitations. The cemetery serves families in ways we don't always understand, provides spaces for connections that transcend the boundaries between life and death. Our cameras capture love in motion, relationships that continue beyond death, family members who find ways to honor promises made to visit more often. The figures walking through our footage aren't trespassers or threats to security. They're family members keeping appointments that matter too much to be canceled by death. I still conduct my hourly patrols, still monitor the cameras for actual security concerns, but I've learned to recognize the difference between problematic activity and devotional activity. Some visitors require physical presence, warm bodies that can be seen and heard and stopped if necessary. Other visitors require only love and intention, qualities that security cameras can document, but physical barriers cannot prevent. The dead rest peacefully at Restwood Memorial Cemetery, watched over by the living during normal hours, and visited by other forces during the quiet hours, when love finds ways to transcend the limitations of death, time, and the normal rules of shadow and light. Some bodies absorb embalming fluid like desert sand absorbs rain, requiring twice the normal amount, as if something beneath the skin refuses to let moisture escape. My name is Ross Turner, and I've been an embalmer at Henderson Mortuary Services for 13 years. Embalming is precise work that follows established procedures, measured amounts of fluid based on body weight and condition, predictable timelines for preservation. The human body behaves consistently during preparation when proper techniques are used, which is why I can estimate fluid requirements within ounces and timing within minutes for any standard case. Until I started encountering bodies that seemed to consume preservation fluid without ever reaching saturation, as if they contained some internal drought that couldn't be quenched. The first case was Margaret Santos, age 67, who died of complications from diabetes. Natural death, no trauma. Body delivered in good condition for preparation. Margaret's family mentioned during arrangements that she'd spent her final years constantly struggling with dehydration, despite drinking water continuously and following medical advice for fluid intake. She was always thirsty, her daughter explained, always carrying water bottles, always drinking, but never feeling satisfied. During preparation, I began the standard arterial injection process, calculating fluid requirements based on Margaret's weight and the condition of her circulatory system. A person of her size and condition should require approximately 2 gallons of embalming fluid for complete preservation. But as I worked, I realized the fluid was disappearing faster than it should, absorbed immediately upon injection, as if her tissues were completely desiccated. I increased the injection rate, thinking the initial estimate had been conservative. But Margaret's body continued absorbing fluid without showing signs of proper saturation. The tissues remained pale and dry-looking, despite receiving nearly double the normal amount of preservation fluid. By the time I achieved adequate preservation, I'd used almost 4 gallons, twice the expected amount. I documented the anomaly carefully, thinking it might be related to her diabetes or dehydration at the time of death. Certain medical conditions can affect tissue absorption during embalming, though I'd never seen such an extreme case. The preparation was successful, and Margaret's viewing went perfectly, but the unusual fluid requirements stayed with me. 3 weeks later, I encountered a similar case with David Chen, age 54, who died of heart failure. David's family mentioned that he'd been obsessed with staying hydrated during his final illness, drinking enormous amounts of water, and constantly complaining about feeling dry and parched. He'd drink a gallon of water and still ask for more, his wife told me. The doctors couldn't explain why he never felt satisfied. David's preparation followed the same pattern as Margaret's. Standard fluid calculations proved completely inadequate. His body absorbed embalming fluid continuously, requiring nearly twice the normal amount before achieving proper preservation. The tissues seemed to draw fluid inward like a sponge, never reaching the saturation point that indicates successful embalming. After the second case, I started paying closer attention to family conversations during arrangement conferences, listening for mentions of thirst, dehydration, or unusual fluid consumption patterns. A disturbing pattern emerged. Families of people who required excessive embalming fluid consistently described loved ones who had been constantly thirsty during their final months or years, unable to feel properly hydrated despite consuming large amounts of water. Elena Rodriguez, whose preparation required 3.5 gallons of fluid, had carried water bottles everywhere during her final year of life. Thomas Kim, who absorbed nearly 4 gallons during embalming, had been hospitalized twice for dehydration, despite drinking water constantly. Sarah Martinez, whose tissues seemed to consume fluid indefinitely, had complained of chronic thirst that no amount of water could satisfy. I began researching medical connections between dehydration, anxiety, and post-mortem tissue absorption, thinking there might be physiological explanations for what I was observing. Certain medications can affect tissue hydration, kidney disease can alter fluid processing, diabetes can create chronic dehydration issues, but none of the medical literature described cases where living patients experienced unquenchable thirst, or where deceased patients required doubled preservation fluid. The pattern became more clear when I started tracking not just the amount of fluid required, but the way it was absorbed during the embalming process. Normal tissue absorption follows predictable patterns: initial resistance, gradual saturation, eventual equilibrium when proper preservation is achieved. But these unusual cases showed continuous absorption without equilibrium, as if the tissues contained some mechanism that prevented saturation regardless of how much fluid was introduced. More significantly, the absorbed fluid seemed to disappear rather than distribute throughout the tissue as expected. Normal embalming creates visible changes in tissue color and texture as preservation fluid replaces blood and cellular fluids. But these cases maintained their original appearance despite absorbing enormous amounts of preservation fluid, as if the fluid was being consumed rather than distributed. During Thomas Kim's preparation, I decided to monitor the process more carefully, documenting exactly where the fluid was going. I injected measured amounts through different arterial access points, tracking distribution through visual examination of tissue changes. What I discovered was medically impossible, but undeniably consistent. The fluid was being absorbed into what seemed like an internal void, disappearing completely rather than preserving tissue. I consulted with Dr. Patricia Wong, a pathologist who occasionally worked with our facility, describing the unusual absorption patterns without mentioning my growing suspicions about the cause. She listened carefully to my technical description and asked several pointed questions about the deceased's medical history. "Sounds like you're dealing with bodies that died in a state of extreme cellular dehydration," she said. "But that level of fluid absorption suggests something beyond normal medical dehydration. It's almost as if the tissues are trying to compensate for some fundamental imbalance that death didn't resolve." Is that medically possible? Not according to current understanding of post-mortem physiology. After death, cellular processes stop, including the mechanisms that regulate fluid absorption. What you're describing sounds more like the tissues are still actively seeking hydration, which shouldn't happen in a deceased body. Dr. Wong agreed to observe my next unusual case, thinking it might represent some rare medical condition that warranted documentation. 2 weeks later, when Robert Santos arrived for preparation, I called her to witness the process. Robert's family had described the same pattern of unquenchable thirst during his final illness. Despite consuming water constantly, he'd never felt satisfied, never felt properly hydrated. His wife mentioned that he'd wake up multiple times each night to drink water, but would still complain of feeling parched by morning. Dr. Wong observed as I began Robert's preparation, documenting the fluid injection process and tissue response. Within 30 minutes, it became clear that Robert's body was following the same impossible absorption pattern as previous cases. Dr. Wong watched the fluid disappear into tissue that showed no corresponding changes in color, texture, or preservation quality. "This is unprecedented," she said quietly, after we'd used nearly 3 gallons of fluid with minimal preservation effect. "The tissue is consuming embalming fluid, like it's still metabolically active, but there's no circulation, no cellular function that could account for this absorption rate. What could cause this? I honestly don't know. It's as if these people died with such profound thirst that their bodies continue seeking fluid even after death." The cellular memory of dehydration is somehow persisting beyond biological function. Dr. Wang suggested that I modify my approach for these cases, using different preservation techniques that might be more effective than standard arterial injection. But her suggestions failed with the next case. Gloria Chen, whose family described decades of unquenchable thirst, absorbed over 5 gallons of preservation fluid through multiple injection methods without achieving adequate preservation. I finally achieved success using a technique that had never occurred to me before. I stopped trying to force saturation and instead allowed the body to absorb fluid at its own rate, replenishing continuously until the absorption finally stopped naturally. With Gloria, this process took nearly 6 hours and used 7 gallons of fluid, but eventually, her tissues reached a state that resembled normal preservation. The process felt less like standard embalming and more like satisfying a profound need that had persisted beyond death. When the absorption finally stopped, Gloria's expression seemed more peaceful, less strained than when she'd arrived. Her family commented on how relaxed she looked during the viewing, how she finally seemed comfortable. I've developed a protocol for these cases now, recognizing them during initial examination by checking with families about thirst patterns during the deceased's final period of life. When I encounter someone who died with unquenchable thirst, I plan for extended preparation time and significantly increased fluid requirements. The work feels different during these preparations. Instead of following mechanical procedures, I find myself responding to what the body seems to need, allowing the tissues to guide the process rather than imposing standard techniques. It's more intensive, more time-consuming, but ultimately more successful than trying to force normal procedures on abnormal cases. Last week, I prepared Helen Martinez, whose family described 30 years of chronic thirst that no medical treatment had been able to resolve. Helen's preparation required 8 gallons of fluid and nearly 8 hours of continuous work. But when the process finally concluded, her tissues had achieved perfect preservation. More importantly, her expression had transformed from the strained, uncomfortable look she'd worn at death to something approaching contentment. During the viewing, Helen's daughter approached me with tears in her eyes. "She looks so peaceful," she said. "For the first time in years, she doesn't look thirsty. Thank you for giving her what she needed. I've learned that some people carry thirst so deep that death can't quench it immediately. They need extra time, extra care, extra fluid to satisfy a need that transcends normal biological function. The embalming process becomes less about preservation and more about completion, helping people find the satisfaction in death that they couldn't find in life. It's taught me that preparation work involves more than technical skill and medical knowledge. Sometimes it requires recognizing that the dead have unfinished business with their own bodies, needs that must be met before they can rest peacefully. Some people need extra fluid not for preservation, but for the simple relief of finally, completely satisfying a thirst that followed them from life into death. The headstones I engrave develop hairline cracks within 48 hours of installation, cracks that spell out words only the deceased's closest family would know. My name is Helen Foster, and I've been a stone engraver at Memorial Arts Monument Company for 16 years. Stone engraving is precise work that requires understanding both the technical properties of granite and marble and the emotional needs of families creating permanent memorials for their loved ones. I cut letters, dates, and symbols that will last for centuries, creating markers that speak for people who can no longer speak for themselves. The stone I work with is solid, stable, designed to withstand weather and time without changing or deteriorating, which is why I notice immediately when headstones begin developing cracks that form letters I never carved. The first occurrence was subtle enough that I initially dismissed it as coincidence. Margaret Wilson's headstone, a simple gray granite marker with her name, dates, and the inscription, "Beloved Mother," developed a small crack near the bottom edge 3 days after installation. The crack was hairline thin, barely visible unless examined closely, but it formed a clear letter M in the space below her engraved information. I assumed the crack resulted from installation stress or natural settling of the stone base. Granite can develop stress fractures during transport or installation, and small cracks occasionally appear as monuments adjust to their new environment. But the M shape was so precise, so clearly formed, that it looked almost intentional. Margaret's daughter called a week later to mention the crack. "There's a small mark on Mother's stone," she said. "It looks like the letter M. My mother's nickname was Maggie, and we always called her M when we were children. Could you have added that somehow?" I explained that no additional engraving had been done after installation, that the mark was likely a natural stone crack, but I promised to examine the headstone and make any necessary repairs. When I visited Margaret's grave, the crack had extended slightly, forming not just an M, but clearly spelling Maggie in thin lines across the stone surface. The cracks looked like they'd been etched with a fine tool, precise and deliberate despite their hairline width. More importantly, they appeared to be carved from the inside of the stone outward, as if pressure from within the granite was creating the letters rather than external force creating random fractures. I repaired the cracks using standard stone restoration techniques, filling them with color-matched granite dust and sealant. The repair was invisible, returning the headstone to its original appearance. But 2 days later, Margaret's daughter called again. "The name came back," she said quietly. "Maggie is written on the stone again, just like before." I returned to find that new cracks had formed in exactly the same pattern, spelling Maggie with the same precision as before. The stone showed no signs of tampering, no tool marks or external damage. The letters had simply reappeared, as if the stone itself insisted on including information that hadn't been part of the original engraving order. After Margaret's case, I started paying closer attention to recent installations, checking for unusual crack patterns during routine maintenance visits. Over the next 3 months, I documented 7 more cases of headstones, developing letter-shaped cracks that spelled words or names relevant to the deceased. Thomas Chen's marker developed cracks spelling Tommy, the childhood nickname his family had mentioned during the ordering process, but decided not to include in the formal engraving. Sarah Rodriguez's stone cracked to form Sunshine, which her husband later confirmed had been his private pet name for her during their 50-year marriage. David Kim's headstone developed cracks, spelling Coach, referring to his volunteer work with Little League Baseball that his family considered mentioning, but ultimately left off the marker to save space. The pattern was consistent and inexplicable. The cracks always appeared within 48 hours of installation, always formed words or names that held personal significance for the deceased, and always spelled information that families had considered, including in the original engraving, but had decided against for various reasons: space limitations, privacy concerns, or formal protocol. I began documenting the crack formations with photographs, measuring their depth and width, analyzing the stone composition around the affected areas. The cracks showed no signs of external carving or damage. They appeared to form from internal pressure, as if the stone was expanding along predetermined lines to create letter shapes. More significantly, the cracks only formed on headstones for people who had died with some form of unfinished communication, things they'd wanted to say, names they'd wanted to be remembered by, identities they'd cherished but never had the chance to make official. I started approaching orders differently, spending more time discussing the deceased's preferences and personality with families. Often, these conversations revealed information that families were hesitant to include on official markers, but that clearly mattered deeply to them. Private nicknames, inside jokes, special terms of endearment that seemed too informal for permanent stone engraving. When Robert Martinez's family mentioned that he'd always insisted people call him Bobby, despite his formal name, I suggested including the nickname in parentheses. "It's his stone," I explained. It should reflect how he wanted to be known. His family agreed, and Robert's headstone was engraved with Robert Bobby Martinez, along with his dates and a brief inscription. After installation, the stone remained crack-free, showing no signs of the letter-forming fractures that had affected other markers. I began experimenting with this approach, encouraging families to include personal names and informal identifiers that reflected the deceased's personality and preferences. Headstones that included these personal touches remained stable after installation, while markers that omitted significant personal information continued developing crack patterns that filled in the missing details. Elena Santos's family had debated, including her maiden name, which she'd continued using professionally throughout her marriage. They ultimately decided on a formal approach, engraving only Elena Santos with her married name. Within 2 days, cracks formed spelling Rodriguez below her engraved name, clearly indicating her maiden name that the family had chosen not to include. I called Elena's daughter to discuss the crack formation. Should we have included her maiden name? I asked. Probably, her daughter admitted. She was always proud of both names, always introduced herself as Elena Rodriguez Santos in professional settings. But we thought it might look too crowded on the stone. I offered to re-engrave the headstone with both names included properly. Elena's family agreed, and the new marker was installed, with Elena Rodriguez Santos engraved clearly and professionally. The stone remained perfect, showing no crack development or letter formation. Last month, I received an unusual order from Margaret Kim's family. Margaret had been a beloved high school teacher, known by hundreds of students as Mrs. K. Her family wanted this nickname included on her headstone, but worried it might seem too informal for a permanent memorial. She loved being called Mrs. K, her husband explained. Students who graduated decades ago still called her that when they visited. It was more than a nickname. It was how she wanted to be remembered. I engraved Margaret's headstone with Margaret, Mrs. K. Kim, prominently displayed along with appropriate tribute text. After installation, the stone remained perfect, stable, free from any crack development. The stone had been given permission to say what it needed to say from the beginning. I've learned that headstones serve as final opportunities for self-expression, chances for the deceased to ensure they're remembered as they chose to live. When families try to impose formal protocols that don't reflect the deceased's actual identity, the stone itself sometimes intervenes, finding ways to include the missing information through crack patterns that can't be permanently repaired. Stone engraving has become more than technical work. It's become collaboration between the living, the dead, and the stone itself. The best monuments are those that reflect the complete identity of the person they commemorate, including nicknames, personal names, and informal identifiers that made them who they were in life. Some stones know things that engravings don't say, and they'll find ways to tell those stories, regardless of formal engraving decisions. My job is to listen to families carefully enough to help them include everything that matters, preventing the stone from having to speak for itself through cracks that form when important information gets left out. The memorial bell rings at the exact moment of death for people who haven't even been brought to our funeral home yet, tolling once for each year of their life. My name is Victor Reeves, and I've been the chapel maintenance worker at Sacred Heart Memorial Chapel for 9 years. My responsibilities include maintaining the building's mechanical systems, ensuring the grounds stay presentable, and caring for our historic memorial bell that sits in the tower above the main chapel. The bell was installed in 1953, cast in bronze with a deep, resonant tone that carries across the entire cemetery during services. It's operated by an electric system that I control manually for funerals, memorial services, and special observances. The bell rings only when I activate it, which is why I was immediately concerned 6 months ago when it began tolling on its own during the quiet hours between services. The first incident occurred on a Tuesday evening while I was cleaning the chapel after a small memorial service. The bell began ringing at 7:43 p.m., a slow, steady toll that continued for exactly 76 strikes before stopping. I assumed there had been an electrical malfunction, perhaps a short circuit in the control system that had triggered an automatic sequence. I climbed to the bell tower to inspect the mechanism, checking for loose connections, damaged wiring, or moisture that might have caused an accidental activation. The system appeared to be functioning normally, with no signs of malfunction or external interference. The control switch remained in the off position where I'd left it after the afternoon service. I documented the incident and made a note to call our electrical contractor the following morning. But before I could arrange for service, I received a call from the county coroner's office requesting transport for someone who had died at 7:43 p.m. the previous evening, exactly when the bell had begun its mysterious tolling. The deceased was Eleanor Martinez, age 76, who had passed away naturally at her home across town. Her family chose our chapel for services, but they hadn't contacted us until the morning after her death. There was no way our bell could have known about Eleanor's passing, yet it had tolled 76 times at the precise moment of her death, once for each year of her life. I convinced myself the timing was coincidental. Death occurs constantly throughout the city, and it would be statistically possible for someone to die at the same moment our bell malfunctioned, even if the connection seemed improbable. But I started paying closer attention to any unusual bell activity, documenting the time and duration of any unexpected tolling. 3 weeks later, the bell rang again at 2:27 a.m., tolling 49 times before stopping. I was working late that night, organizing supplies in the basement storage area, when the deep bronze tone echoed through the building. This time I immediately climbed to the tower, reaching the bell mechanism while it was still ringing. The bell was operating exactly as if I had activated the electric controls, moving with the proper rhythm and force of a controlled sequence. But the control switch remained off, and I could see no electrical activity that would account for the automatic operation. The bell completed its 49 tolls and stopped, leaving the tower silent and the mechanism motionless. The next morning, I called the coroner's office on impulse, asking if anyone had died around 2:30 a.m. The officer confirmed that James Rodriguez, age 49, had been pronounced dead at 2:27 a.m. following a heart attack. His family contacted our chapel later that week to arrange services. I began keeping a detailed log of bell activity, noting the time, duration, and number of tolls for any unexpected ringing. Over the following months, the pattern became undeniable. The bell tolled spontaneously at the exact moment of death for people who would later be brought to our chapel for services, always ringing once for each year of the deceased's life. The bell somehow knew about deaths before we did, responding to the moment of passing with appropriate acknowledgement, even when families hadn't yet decided where to hold services. It tolled for Margaret Chen at 11:15 p.m. 68 times for her 68 years. It rang for David Kim at 6:42 a.m. 55 tolls for his 55 years of life. I started cross-referencing my bell log with our service bookings, discovering that every unexplained tolling sequence corresponded to someone who would later be scheduled for services at our chapel. The bell never rang for people who ended up at other funeral homes, never tolled for deaths that didn't eventually connect to our facility. Father Morrison, who conducted most of our services, became interested in the phenomenon when I shared my documentation with him. He'd been working at Sacred Heart for over 20 years and had noticed unusual bell activity himself, but had never tracked it systematically. Bells have been associated with death announcements for centuries, he explained during one of our conversations. In medieval times, church bells would toll to announce deaths in the community, helping people know when to pray for souls in transition. Maybe our bell is continuing that tradition in its own way. But how does it know who's going to choose our chapel? Maybe it doesn't know about our chapel specifically. Maybe it responds to souls who need what we provide: comfort, dignity, proper farewell. Some people are drawn to certain places even in death, And perhaps the bell recognizes that connection before the family consciously makes their decision. Father Morrison suggested that I start attending to the bell tower during its spontaneous tolling, treating these moments as sacred observances rather than mechanical malfunctions. He encouraged me to listen respectfully when the bell rang, understanding that someone had just completed their earthly journey and deserved acknowledgement. I began climbing to the tower whenever the bell tolled unexpectedly, standing quietly while it completed its count of years lived. The experience felt different when approached as witnessing rather than troubleshooting. The bell's tone seemed deeper, more resonant, more purposeful when I understood it was marking someone's transition from life to death. Last week, the bell tolled at 3:15 a.m., ringing 34 times before falling silent. I climbed to the tower and stood quietly while it completed its count, then said a simple prayer for whoever had just died, knowing they would eventually find their way to our chapel for final services. The next afternoon, I received a call from Maria Santos, whose 34-year-old brother Carlos had died unexpectedly at 3:15 a.m. She'd been calling funeral homes all day, trying to find a place that felt right for her brother's services. When she arrived at Sacred Heart, she said the chapel felt peaceful, like Carlos would approve of the choice. "There's something about this place," she told me, while reviewing service options. "It feels like Carlos is already here somehow, like he's been waiting for us to find him." I didn't mention the bell tolling at the moment of her brother's death, but I understood what she meant. Sacred Heart Chapel attracts people who need what we provide, and the bell serves as an early warning system, alerting us when someone who belongs here has begun their final journey. I've stopped treating the spontaneous tolling as a mechanical problem requiring repair. Instead, I maintain the bell system carefully, ensuring it can respond properly when called upon to announce deaths and mark the completion of lives that will eventually find their way to our chapel. The bell knows things I don't know, responds to connections I can't see, serves purposes that extend beyond our scheduled services and planned observances. Some people choose our chapel, and some people are chosen by it. The bell helps me distinguish between the two, marking deaths that will become our responsibility, with tolls that count the years of lives we'll soon be honored to commemorate. Closed casket services sometimes reveal slightly opened lids by morning, though the latches remain secure and undisturbed, opening just wide enough for someone to breathe if they needed to. My name is Rebecca Walsh, and I've been a funeral assistant at Riverside Memorial Home for 8 years. My responsibilities include preparing viewing rooms, coordinating with families during services, and ensuring that everything remains dignified and appropriate throughout the entire process. I work closely with bodies during viewings, making small adjustments to positioning, clothing, and flowers to maintain the best possible presentation for grieving families. I know exactly how caskets should look, how they should remain closed when that's what families have chosen, and why they should never open on their own, which is why I was immediately concerned when I began finding caskets with slightly raised lids after closed casket services, opened just enough to suggest someone inside needed access to fresh air. The first incident occurred after Robert Martinez's memorial service. Robert had been in a car accident that made an open casket viewing impossible, so his family chose a closed casket service, with a large photograph displayed beside the casket. The service was beautiful, respectful, and well attended. After the family and guests departed, I performed my usual end-of-day routine, ensuring the viewing room was properly secured before locking up for the night. Robert's casket was completely closed, latched securely according to our standard procedures. I double-checked the latches myself, making sure they were properly engaged and that the lid sat flush against the base. Everything looked exactly as it should for a closed casket service. The next morning, when I arrived to prepare for the funeral procession, I found Robert's casket with its lid slightly raised, not dramatically opened, but lifted just enough to create a gap of about 2 inches at the head end. The gap was precisely the width needed for air circulation, as if someone had carefully adjusted the lid to allow breathing space. I immediately checked the latches, expecting to find mechanical failure or improper closure, but the latches remained fully engaged and secure. The casket appeared to have opened from the inside, raising the lid against the resistance of properly functioning hardware. There were no signs of tampering, no evidence that anyone had accessed the viewing room during the night. I carefully closed the casket, re-engaging the latches and ensuring proper alignment. But the incident troubled me enough that I mentioned it to our funeral director, Mr. Harrison, who had been with Riverside for over 20 years. "Caskets don't open themselves," he said matter-of-factly. "Either the latches weren't properly engaged or someone accessed the room after hours. Neither scenario is acceptable. So, we need to be more careful with security and closure procedures." I accepted his explanation, though I was certain about the latch engagement the previous evening. I started paying closer attention to casket closure, documenting the position and security of latches after each service. But 3 weeks later, the same thing happened with Margaret Chen's casket. Margaret's family had also chosen a closed casket service due to her extended illness. I secured the casket personally after the memorial service, testing each latch and verifying that the lid was completely closed. The next morning, I found the casket with its lid raised approximately 2 inches, just enough to allow air circulation, but not enough to compromise dignity or security. Again, the latches remained fully engaged. Again, there was no evidence of tampering or unauthorized access. The casket had somehow opened itself just enough to provide breathing space, as if someone inside had made a careful adjustment for comfort. I began staying late after closed casket services, positioning myself where I could observe the viewing room without being obvious about surveillance. During my third vigil, watching over David Kim's closed casket, I witnessed something that challenged everything I thought I knew about post-mortem behavior. At approximately 2:30 a.m., David's casket lid began to rise slowly, lifting against the resistance of engaged latches with smooth, deliberate motion. The movement stopped when the gap reached exactly 2 inches, the same opening width I'd observed in previous cases. The casket remained in this position for the rest of the night, looking exactly as I'd found other opened caskets on previous mornings. I approached the casket carefully, examining the latches and testing the lid closure. The latches showed no signs of mechanical failure, and the lid moved smoothly back into closed position when I applied gentle pressure. But within minutes of stepping away, the lid began rising again, settling into the same 2-inch opening. The pattern suggested that someone inside the casket was making conscious adjustments for comfort, lifting the lid just enough to allow air circulation without compromising the dignity of the closed casket service. But David Kim had been dead for 3 days, properly embalmed, and prepared according to standard procedures. I started researching the families who had chosen closed casket services, looking for common factors that might explain the lid opening phenomenon. A disturbing pattern emerged. Every case involved someone who had died with significant breathing difficulties, lung disease, drowning, suffocation, or respiratory failure. These were people who had struggled for breath during their final moments, who had died with the desperate need for air as their last conscious experience. Robert Martinez had died when his crushed chest prevented proper breathing after the car accident. Margaret Chen had suffered from emphysema, spending her final weeks gasping for air despite oxygen support. David Kim had drowned, his death caused by the inability to breathe normally. I began approaching closed casket services differently, understanding that some people might continue to seek breathing space even after death, especially if their final experience involved respiratory distress. Instead of fighting the lid opening phenomenon, I started accommodating it discreetly. When preparing viewing rooms for closed casket services, I began positioning flowers and decorations to partially conceal the casket head area, creating visual privacy that would hide minor lid adjustments. I also started using caskets with higher quality ventilation systems, thinking that better air circulation might reduce the need for lid opening. The approach worked partially. Caskets with better ventilation showed less dramatic lid movement, though they still opened slightly during the night. The flower arrangement successfully concealed minor adjustments, maintaining dignity while allowing the deceased whatever comfort they seemed to need. Last month, I had a conversation with Elena Rodriguez, whose husband had died of lung cancer and was scheduled for a closed casket service. Elena mentioned her concern about the closed casket decision. Manuel always hated feeling trapped or confined, she explained. Even sleeping, he needed fresh air, needed to feel like he could breathe freely. I worry that a completely closed casket might make him uncomfortable. I suggested a compromise that had been developing in my mind over months of observing the lid opening phenomenon. What if we position the casket so that it's essentially closed but allows for slight adjustment if needed? We can arrange flowers to maintain privacy while ensuring he has whatever comfort is possible. Elena agreed to the modified approach. During Manuel's service, I secured the casket latches loosely, allowing for movement while maintaining proper closure. The service proceeded beautifully, and the family found comfort in knowing that Manuel's needs for breathing space were being respected. The following morning, Manuel's casket showed minimal lid adjustment, less than an inch of opening compared to the 2-inch gaps I'd observed in previous cases. The loose latch approach seemed to provide the flexibility needed without creating dramatic overnight changes. I've developed a protocol now for closed casket services involving people who died with breathing difficulties. I discuss comfort considerations sensitively with families, explaining that some adjustments might occur and that we can accommodate them discreetly. Most families appreciate the thoughtfulness, understanding that dignity and comfort can coexist. The work has taught me that death doesn't immediately eliminate all physical preferences and needs. Some people require breathing space even after breathing stops, need air circulation even when circulation has ended. Accommodating these needs doesn't compromise professional standards. It demonstrates respect for the continuing comfort of people who struggled for breath during their final moments. Closed casket services can honor both family preferences and the deceased's need for air circulation. Sometimes the most dignified approach is acknowledging that death doesn't immediately resolve every physical concern, that some people need breathing space regardless of whether they're actively breathing. Certain caskets become significantly heavier during the procession to graveside, requiring additional bearers who weren't planned for the service, returning to normal weight once lowered into the earth. My name is Luis Morales, and I've been coordinating pallbearer services at Memorial Gardens Cemetery for 12 years. Pallbearer coordination involves calculating the number of bearers needed based on casket weight, deceased weight, and the distance from hearse to graveside. It's mathematical work that follows consistent formulas. A standard casket with average contents requires 6 bearers for distances under 50 yards, 8 bearers for longer processions or difficult terrain. I've never miscalculated a bearer requirement in 12 years. Never had a casket become too heavy for the planned crew, until I started encountering caskets that gained weight during transport, becoming so heavy that additional bearers had to join the procession to prevent dropping the deceased. The first incident occurred during Elena Rodriguez's funeral. Elena had been a small woman, 93 years old, who weighed perhaps 90 pounds at the time of death. Her simple pine casket added another 40 pounds, creating a total load of approximately 130 pounds, easily manageable for 6 experienced pallbearers, over the 30-yard distance from parking area to gravesite. The pallbearers lifted Elena's casket without difficulty at the hearse, carrying it smoothly for the first 20 yards of the procession. But as they approached the graveside, I noticed them beginning to struggle with the weight. Their pace slowed, their steps became labored, and several bearers showed visible strain that hadn't been present during the initial lift. "This thing's getting heavier," whispered Miguel Santos, the lead pallbearer, as they paused briefly to adjust their grip. Feels like it weighs twice what it did at the car. I assumed they were experiencing fatigue or had misjudged the initial weight. But as they resumed walking, their difficulty became more pronounced. Two additional men from Elena's family stepped in to assist, supporting the casket from the sides to prevent dropping. What should have been a routine six-bearer carry required 8 people by the time they reached the grave. Once the casket was positioned on the lowering device and the pallbearers stepped back, I asked Miguel about the weight increase. Started normal, he confirmed, but got heavier with every step, like someone was climbing inside during the walk. I checked with the funeral director about the casket contents, thinking additional items might have been added after our initial weight calculations. But Elena's casket contained only her body and the simple personal items that had been planned from the beginning. There was no logical explanation for the dramatic weight increase during transport. I documented the incident carefully, noting the number of bearers required and the point during procession when additional help became necessary. But I assumed it was an isolated case until similar weight problems occurred during Robert Martinez's funeral 3 weeks later. Robert had been a larger man, 160 pounds, in a standard oak casket, adding another 70 pounds. I'd calculated for 8 bearers, given the total weight of 230 pounds and the 40-yard distance to his gravesite. The initial lift went perfectly, with bearers commenting on how manageable the weight felt. But halfway through the procession, the same phenomenon occurred. The bearers began struggling with increasing weight, eventually requiring 4 additional family members to assist with the final 20 yards to the graveside. By the time they reached the grave, 12 people were supporting a casket that should have required only 8. I started paying closer attention to the specific families experiencing weight increases, looking for common factors that might explain the phenomenon. A pattern emerged that was both consistent and heartbreaking. Every case of increased casket weight involved someone who had died far from their birthplace, someone whose family had mentioned their desire to go home during final illness. Elena Rodriguez had been born in Mexico, living in the United States for over 60 years, but always talking about wanting to return to her childhood village. Robert Martinez had grown up in Puerto Rico, spending his adult life in the mainland, but frequently expressing homesickness for the island where he'd been born. The weight increases seemed to occur when people who had died away from home were literally trying to stay connected to the place where they were being buried, reluctant to be lowered into earth that wasn't their birthplace. The additional weight felt like resistance, like someone clinging to whatever connection they could maintain with the living world, rather than accepting burial in foreign soil. I began researching the burial locations for people experiencing weight increases, mapping the distances between birthplace and final resting place. Every case involved someone buried hundreds or thousands of miles from where they'd been born. People buried near their birthplace showed no unusual weight fluctuations during transport. The phenomenon became more predictable once I understood the pattern. When coordinating services for people who had died far from home, I automatically planned for additional bearers, explaining to families that some processions required extra support for emotional rather than physical reasons. Father Giuseppe, who conducted many of our services, became interested in the weight phenomenon when I shared my observations with him. He'd noticed struggling pallbearers himself, but hadn't connected it to birthplace distances until I pointed out the pattern. Attachment to homeland runs deeper than most people realize, he explained during one of our conversations. For people who spent their lives longing to return home, burial in foreign soil might feel like a final separation from everything they've loved. The additional weight could represent their reluctance to let go of that connection. But they're already dead. How can they influence physical weight? Death doesn't immediately sever all emotional attachments. Some people carry homesickness so profound that it persists beyond life, expressing itself through whatever means available. If their bodies are the last physical connection to their homeland, they might resist burial until that connection is properly honored. Father Giuseppe suggested modifying our approach to these services, acknowledging the deceased's homeland connection explicitly before beginning the procession. He began incorporating brief prayers that recognized the distance from birthplace and offered comfort for the journey ahead. The modified approach helped significantly. When Father Giuseppe offered prayers specifically addressing homesickness and distance from birthplace, the subsequent processions showed less dramatic weight increases. The caskets still became heavier, but the effect was more manageable, requiring only 1 or 2 additional bearers rather than doubling the crew size. I started incorporating homeland acknowledgement into my pallbearer briefings, explaining to bearers that they might experience increased weight during transport, and that additional family members should be prepared to assist if needed. Most families understood and appreciated the sensitivity to their loved one's attachment to distant homelands. The most dramatic case occurred during Maria Santos's funeral. Maria had been born in El Salvador, living in the United States for 40 years, but never becoming completely comfortable with English or American customs. Her family mentioned that she'd talked constantly about wanting to visit her childhood village one more time, wanting to see the mountains where she'd grown up. Maria's casket required 14 bearers by the time they reached her graveside, despite initial calculations for only 6. The weight increase was so pronounced that we had to pause twice during the 30-yard procession to recruit additional help from mourners. The casket felt like it contained not just Maria's body, but the weight of 40 years of homesickness. During the graveside service, Father Giuseppe offered an extended prayer, acknowledging Maria's love for El Salvador, her longing for the mountains of her childhood, and her right to carry that love with her into eternity. As he spoke, I noticed the bearers who were still supporting the casket seemed to relax, as if the weight they'd been carrying had somehow lessened. After the service, Maria's son approached me with tears in his eyes. "She fought so hard to stay connected to home," he said. "Even at the end, she was trying to hold on to El Salvador. Thank you for understanding that and helping her find peace with being buried here." I realized that the weight increases weren't just physical phenomena. They were requests for acknowledgement, appeals for recognition of the sacrifice involved in being buried away from homeland. When that sacrifice was honored explicitly, the resistance diminished. I've developed a protocol now for services involving people who died far from their birthplace. I discuss homeland connections with families during planning, incorporate that information into pallbearer preparations, and coordinate with clergy to include appropriate acknowledgments during services. The work has taught me that some people carry geography in their souls, hold connections to birthplace that death doesn't automatically sever. Being buried away from home represents a final separation that some people resist until their attachment to homeland is properly recognized and honored. Last week, I coordinated services for Carlos Chen, who had been born in the Philippines but lived his entire adult life in the United States. His family mentioned his frequent stories about childhood in Manila, his plans to visit that never materialized, his regret about never taking his grandchildren to see where he'd grown up. I planned for 10 bearers instead of the calculated 6, briefed them about potential weight increases, and coordinated with Father Giuseppe to include homeland acknowledgement in the service. The procession went smoothly, requiring only 1 additional bearer and showing minimal weight fluctuation. After Carlos was lowered into the ground, his casket seemed to settle naturally, peacefully, as if he'd finally accepted burial in American soil after having his Filipino heritage properly acknowledged. The resistance was gone, replaced by what felt like acceptance. The weight that some caskets gain during transport isn't just physical, it's emotional, representing the heaviness of being separated from homeland, the burden of dying in foreign soil. Acknowledging that burden, honoring those geographic connections, helps ease the transition from life to burial for people whose hearts never fully left their birthplace. Pallbearer coordination has become more than calculating physical requirements. It's become part of helping people find peace with their final resting place, ensuring that love for distant homelands doesn't have to be abandoned along with life itself. Some journeys require extra bearers, not because of weight, but because of love that's too heavy for standard calculations to accommodate. Obituary records occasionally update themselves, adding new information about the deceased's final moments that wasn't known when originally filed, always accurate when later confirmed by family members. My name is Dorothy Kim, and I've been the archive keeper at Metropolitan Funeral Records for 14 years. My work involves maintaining comprehensive records of all services, preserving obituary information, and ensuring that families can access accurate documentation of their loved ones' final arrangements. I manage both physical filing systems and digital databases, cross-referencing information to maintain accuracy and completeness across all our memorial records. Record keeping is precise work that requires attention to detail and respect for permanence. When families provide information for obituaries and service records, that information becomes part of an official archive that will be referenced for decades. Changes to records require authorization, documentation, and careful verification. Records don't update themselves, which is why I was immediately concerned when I began finding additions to obituary files that I hadn't made and no one had authorized. The first incident occurred with Robert Martinez's records. Robert had died suddenly of a heart attack, and his family provided basic information for the obituary. Survived by wife Elena, 3 children, worked as a mechanic for 30 years, enjoyed fishing and spending time with grandchildren. Standard information, properly documented, filed according to our usual procedures. 3 days after Robert's service, I was updating digital files when I noticed additional text in his obituary record. Robert spent his final moments thinking about the fishing trip he'd planned with his grandson Miguel for the following weekend. He died peacefully, without pain, while imagining the lake where he'd taught all his children to fish. The addition was seamlessly integrated into the original text, formatted correctly, written in the same style as the rest of the obituary. But I had no record of receiving this information from Robert's family, no authorization for changes to his file, no explanation for how the additional text had appeared in our system. I assumed there had been a miscommunication, that Elena Martinez had provided this information, and I'd somehow failed to document the addition properly. But when I called Elena to confirm the new text, she was surprised to hear about it. "That's exactly right," she said, her voice emotional. Robert was talking about taking Miguel fishing the day before he died. He'd been planning the trip for weeks, so excited about it. "But how did you know that?" "I never told anyone at the funeral home about the fishing trip." I explained that the information had been added to Robert's record, though I couldn't identify who had provided it. Elena confirmed that every detail was accurate. Robert had indeed been planning a fishing trip with his grandson, had talked about it extensively, and had likely been thinking about it during his final moments. I documented the incident carefully, thinking it represented some failure in our information gathering procedures. But 2 weeks later, the same thing happened with Margaret Chen's records. Margaret's original obituary was standard and brief, mentioning her age, surviving family, and long career as a school teacher. But additional text appeared in her file without authorization. Margaret's last words were spoken to her daughter Lisa. "Take care of the garden, especially the roses. They need someone who understands how much love goes into making beautiful things grow." She died surrounded by the scent of the roses she'd tended for 40 years. Again, the addition was perfectly formatted and seamlessly integrated into the original text. Again, I had no record of receiving this information from Margaret's family. When I contacted Lisa Chen to verify the accuracy, she confirmed every detail but expressed confusion about how we'd obtained such personal information. "Those were her exact last words," Lisa confirmed. "But that conversation was private, just between us. I didn't share it with anyone at the funeral home because it seemed too personal for the official obituary." I began monitoring our record system more carefully, checking files regularly for unauthorized additions or changes. Over the following months, I documented 12 more cases of obituary records updating themselves with detailed information about the deceased's final moments, last words, final thoughts, peaceful descriptions of their death experience. Every addition was accurate when verified with families, but none of the families had shared this information with our staff. The additions consistently provided intimate details about the deceased's final hours that only close family members would know, details that families had chosen to keep private rather than include in public obituaries. I consulted with our IT department about possible system failures or unauthorized access to our databases. The technicians found no evidence of external intrusion, no security breaches, no technical explanations for text appearing in carefully protected files. The additions seemed to originate from within our system, though no staff member had authorization to make changes without proper documentation. The pattern of additions followed consistent themes: final words that expressed love or concern for family, peaceful descriptions of the death experience, references to cherished activities or memories, reassurances that the death had been without suffering. The additions never contradicted existing information. They only provided additional details that made the death seem more peaceful and meaningful. Father Thompson, who conducted many services at our affiliated chapel, became interested in the phenomenon when I shared my documentation with him. He'd noticed that families seemed unusually comforted by our obituary records, often commenting on how accurately they captured their loved one's peaceful passing. Maybe the additions aren't coming from external sources, he suggested during one of our discussions. Maybe they're coming from the deceased themselves, finding ways to provide comfort to families by ensuring their final moments are remembered accurately and peacefully. But that's not technically possible. Death isn't just a technical event. It's a spiritual transition that we don't fully understand. If someone's primary concern at death was providing comfort to their family, they might find ways to continue offering that comfort, ensuring that their final moments are recorded in ways that bring peace rather than pain. Father Thompson suggested that I start approaching the additions as gifts rather than problems, understanding that they might represent continuing care from the deceased for their grieving families. Instead of trying to prevent the additions, he encouraged me to document them carefully and verify their accuracy with families. I began handling the additions differently, treating them as supplemental information that enhanced rather than corrupted our records. When families called to verify additions, I framed them positively, explaining that additional peaceful details had been included to provide comfort and completeness. Most families appreciated the additions once they understood their purpose. Elena Rodriguez, whose husband's record had been updated with details about his peaceful passing, said the additions helped her process her grief more effectively. Knowing that he died thinking about good memories instead of suffering makes everything easier to bear, she explained. I started anticipating additions for certain types of deaths: sudden passings where families worried about suffering, deaths where loved ones had been alone during final moments, cases where families expressed concern about whether the deceased had been afraid or in pain during death. The additions consistently provided reassurance for these concerns, offering details that suggested peaceful, comfortable final moments, regardless of the circumstances of death. Families who received these additions reported feeling more at peace with their loss, more confident that their loved one had died without distress. Last month, I received an addition to Thomas Santos's record that demonstrated how precisely these updates address family concerns. Thomas had died alone in a car accident, and his family worried that he'd been frightened or in pain during his final moments. The addition read, Thomas's final thoughts were of gratitude for his family's love and excitement about reuniting with his parents, who had passed before him. He experienced no fear or pain, only peace and anticipation for the journey ahead. When I called Thomas's sister to verify this addition, she broke down crying. "That's exactly what I needed to hear," she said. I've been so worried that he died, scared and alone. Knowing he was thinking about family and feeling peaceful changes everything. I've learned that obituary records serve purposes beyond documentation. They provide comfort, preserve dignity, and offer reassurance during the most difficult times in people's lives. The additions that appear in our files might not follow standard procedures, but they serve those purposes more effectively than the limited information families initially provide. Archive keeping has become more than maintaining accurate records. It's become part of helping families find peace with their losses, ensuring that final moments are remembered in ways that honor both truth and comfort. Some information is too important to be limited by what families choose to share publicly, and sometimes the most accurate records are those that include details only the deceased themselves could provide. Certain urns develop condensation on the inside glass, forming patterns that look like fingerprints pressed from within, phenomenon that only occurs with people who were cremated against their stated wishes. My name is Marcus Thompson, and I've been operating the crematorium at Eternal Peace Memorial Services for 11 years. Cremation is a technical process that requires careful temperature control, proper timing, and respectful handling of remains throughout the entire procedure. After cremation, we place cremated remains in urns, selected by families, seal them according to manufacturer specifications, and deliver them with appropriate documentation of the process. Sealed urns don't develop internal condensation under normal circumstances. The cremation process removes all moisture from remains, and proper sealing prevents outside humidity from entering the container. When condensation appears inside sealed urns, it indicates either improper sealing or contamination during the cremation process, both serious problems that require immediate investigation. Which is why I was deeply concerned when I began finding fingerprint-shaped condensation patterns on the inside glass of certain urns, moisture that shouldn't exist, and patterns that suggested someone was pressing against the glass from within. The first case involved Eleanor Martinez, whose family had chosen cremation over burial, despite Eleanor's previously expressed preference for traditional burial. Eleanor's daughter explained the decision during arrangement discussions. Mother always said she wanted to be buried, but cremation is more practical for our family. We're scattered across different states, and this way, everyone can have a part of her to keep close. Eleanor's cremation proceeded normally, and her remains were placed in a beautiful glass-fronted urn that her family had selected. I sealed the urn personally, according to manufacturer specifications, ensuring proper closure and documenting the process completely. The urn was clear glass with no visible moisture or condensation when sealed. 3 days later, when Eleanor's daughter came to collect the urn, I noticed small patches of condensation on the inside surface of the glass. The condensation wasn't random. It formed distinct patterns that looked remarkably like handprints pressed against the glass from inside the urn. 5 separate prints were visible, each showing the detail of fingers and palm, as if someone had pressed their hand against the glass repeatedly. I immediately assumed there had been a sealing failure, that outside humidity had somehow entered the urn and created the condensation patterns. But when I examined the seal, it remained intact and properly engaged. The urn showed no signs of tampering or mechanical failure. Yet somehow moisture had developed inside the sealed container. I offered to replace the urn and reseal Eleanor's remains, explaining that condensation indicated a technical problem with the closure. But Eleanor's daughter seemed more fascinated than concerned by the handprint patterns. "They look like mother's hands," she said quietly, studying the prints carefully. She had very distinctive fingers, long and thin from years of piano playing. These prints look exactly like hers. I assumed the resemblance was coincidental, that grief can make people see familiar patterns in random formations. But I documented the incident thoroughly and began monitoring other urns more carefully for signs of internal condensation or sealing problems. Over the following months, I identified 6 more cases of mysterious condensation in sealed urns. Every case involved someone who had been cremated against their previously expressed wishes, people who had wanted traditional burial, but whose families chose cremation for practical, financial, or personal reasons. The condensation patterns were consistent across all cases, handprint-shaped formations that appeared to be pressed against the glass from inside the urn, always developing within 72 hours of sealing, always occurring despite proper sealing and proper cremation procedures. Robert Chen had told his family he wanted to be buried next to his wife, but his children chose cremation because the cemetery plot was too expensive. Thomas Rodriguez had requested burial in his hometown, but his family chose cremation because transporting the body would be too complicated. Sarah Kim had specifically requested burial because she was claustrophobic and feared cremation, but her family chose cremation because they lived in a small apartment with no space for memorial visits. Each of these cases resulted in handprint condensation inside properly sealed urns, moisture that shouldn't exist, creating patterns that looked like someone trying to push their way out of confinement. I began approaching these situations differently, understanding that the condensation might represent distress rather than technical failure. Instead of offering to reseal the urns, I started discussing the phenomenon sensitively with families, explaining that some people who were cremated against their wishes might need additional time to adjust to their final arrangement. Most families appreciated this approach, though some requested traditional burial after seeing the handprint condensation in their loved one's urn. When families changed their decision and chose burial, the condensation patterns typically faded within days, as if the deceased had found peace with the alternative arrangement. Margaret Santos's case provided the clearest example of this pattern. Margaret had requested burial in her family plot, but her son chose cremation because he lived across the country and couldn't easily visit a grave. When handprint condensation appeared in Margaret's urn, her son decided to honor her original wishes and arranged for burial in the family cemetery. After Margaret's remains were buried according to her preferences, I checked her original urn and found that the condensation had completely disappeared. The glass was clear and dry, showing no signs of the moisture patterns that had been visible for weeks. I started recommending that families consider the deceased's stated preferences more carefully, explaining that some people adjust better to cremation than others, and that handprint condensation might indicate discomfort with the chosen arrangement. Father Martinez, who conducted many of our memorial services, became interested in the condensation phenomenon when I shared my observations with him. He'd noticed that families dealing with handprint condensation often seemed more troubled by their cremation decision than other families. Choice and consent matter even after death, he explained during one of our conversations. Some people feel so strongly about burial versus cremation that the preference persists beyond life. The handprints might represent their way of communicating that their wishes haven't been honored. But they're already cremated. How can burial still be an option? Cremated remains can still be buried if families choose to honor the original preference. The physical form has changed, but the location and treatment of remains can still reflect the deceased's wishes. Father Martinez suggested that I discuss burial options with families experiencing handprint condensation, explaining that cremated remains could be interred in traditional cemeteries if that better honored the deceased's preferences. This approach proved successful in most cases. Families who buried their loved ones' cremated remains typically reported that handprint condensation stopped developing, and urns that had been displaying moisture patterns became clear and stable. Last week, I handled the cremation for David Kim, whose family mentioned that he'd been adamant about wanting burial rather than cremation. He said cremation felt too much like being trapped, his wife explained, but our budget just doesn't allow for traditional burial and cemetery costs. I discussed the option of cremation followed by burial in a cemetery that accepted urns, explaining that this approach could honor both David's preference for earth burial and the family's financial constraints. David's family agreed to this compromise, planning to bury his urn in a cemetery plot that cost significantly less than full-body burial. David's urn remained clear and condensation-free after sealing, showing no signs of the handprint patterns that had appeared in other cases. The compromise arrangement seemed to address both the practical needs of the family and the stated preferences of the deceased. I've learned that cremation choice involves more than practical considerations. It requires understanding and honoring the deceased's feelings about their final arrangement. Some people carry strong preferences about burial versus cremation that persist beyond death, expressing themselves through whatever means available when their wishes aren't honored. The condensation patterns aren't technical failures, they're communications from people who need their preferences acknowledged and respected. Cremation can be appropriate for anyone, but only when it aligns with their wishes or when suitable compromises can be found that honor their need for earth burial. Working with families to find arrangements that balance practical needs with the deceased's stated preferences has become an important part of my responsibilities. Some people need traditional burial, some adapt well to cremation, and some need creative solutions that honor their concerns while accommodating family limitations. The handprints that appear on urn glass aren't signs of distress. They're requests for reconsideration, appeals for arrangements that better reflect the deceased's understanding of how they want to rest for eternity.